Astronaut Steve Austin is a man who is barely alive. We can rebuild him, gentlemen.
He was the $6 million man, living the dream, unstoppable, and admired. With a smile that brightened every space, she was the most recognizable lady on television.
They appeared to be the ideal Hollywood power couple.
Behind closed doors, however, their story descended into heartache, treachery, and decades of silence. The reality was nothing like the beautiful magazine covers.
She was never forgiven by Lee Majors. And you'll know why after you learn the truth about what transpired.
Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were just two bright-eyed performers attempting to establish themselves in a field that was equal parts gorgeous and cruel long before their names were inscribed on the fabric of American popular culture. Lee was already blazing his own trail.
He was born Harvey Lee Urey in Michigan and grew up in Kentucky.
Casting directors admired his rugged good looks and quiet assurance. Starring with Barbara Stanwyck in The Big Valley, he gained his first genuine break and immediately established himself as a professional actor with unquestionable screen presence.
Conversely, Farrah was a Texas-based Southern beauty queen.
She relocated to Los Angeles to pursue modeling after attracting the attention of photographers, agencies, and producers with her captivating grin and camera-ready charm. Even before her name was known, her appearance was famous. She had a shine in her eyes, sun-kissed hair, and that unique ability to look both elegant and approachable.
At a gathering in the late 1960s, friends introduced them.
And the chemistry was immediate, according to those there.
Lee was already well known on TV.
And Farrah was only beginning. However, there was more to the relationship than meets the eye. Lee was faithful, modest, and restrained.
Farrah was lively, humorous, and vivacious.
She was grounded by him. He was inspired by her. It was the sort of match made in heaven. In 1973, they were married. It also appeared to be a Hollywood dream for a while. Lee had recently been cast in The $6 Million Man as Colonel Steve Austin, the part of a lifetime.
With millions of viewers each week, the show was a huge hit and made Lee a household name.
Across America, his face appeared on posters, lunchboxes, and action toys.
Farrah's modeling career, meanwhile, took off.
She had appearances in magazine spreads and shampoo commercials before gradually beginning to obtain acting parts. Lee was excited to see her excel because her big break was just around the corner.
He lauded her talent and beauty in interviews at the time,
referring to her as his true love. They were golden to the outside world. Magazine covers, celebrity parties, and red carpet events. They appeared to be a match made in heaven. However, the cracks that were developing just below the surface were invisible to the general population.
Seldom did their schedules coincide. Lee was putting in a lot of overtime on his TV. Farrah was establishing her own profession, networking, and going to auditions.
They were gradually being torn apart by the very prominence they had strived so hard to attain.
Lee attempted to hang on, though.
He had faith in her and in their marriage. However, not always in a negative way, but occasionally in ways that render the person who knew them best unrecognizable. Fame has a way of altering people. And while Farrah's star was about to soar beyond anyone's expectations, their idyllic marriage was going to encounter challenges that no outsider could fathom.
Farrah Fawcett did not just become well known. Few people ever achieved the amount of fame that she did. Everything changed in an instant when she joined the Charlie's Angels ensemble in 1976. Despite the show's immediate global success, Farrah rose above the status of a mere TV actor.
She turned into the face of the time, representing glitz, self-reliance, and carefree beauty. 1,000 teenage crushes were sparked by this poster.
Farrah in the one-piece red bathing suit
sold more than 12 million copies while grinning and sporting windswept hair. That picture turned into one of the 20th century's most recognizable images.
She was everywhere all of a sudden.
Advertisements for products, billboards, magazine covers, and talk programs.
Farrah was unavoidable, not just well-liked.
Even though she was loved by millions, her quick ascent to prominence put a great deal of stress on the already strained marriage.
At this point, Farrah was being pulled in all directions.
She has stylists and publicists filling her schedule, producers pitching jobs, and businesses vying for her endorsements. Her husband, Lee Majors, frequently found himself waiting on the sidelines while her time became a luxury. Lee was accustomed to long hours on set and the sacrifices that come with being a television star, having made a name for himself owing to the $6 million guy. Even he, however, was unprepared for the chaos that Farrah's celebrity brought into their house. Sweet, solid, and deeply rooted in Texas, the lady he had married was evolving into something else. Not harsher or colder, simply aloof and engrossed in the fame machine. According to rumors that have been verified by numerous sources, Lee requested that the producers of her show change the time she was filming so that they may have dinner together a few times a week. The request was straightforward: the husband wanted to spend more time with his wife. However, Farrah allegedly said no. She didn't want her spouse to think she was reliant on him. Although praiseworthy, her intense independence simply served to deepen their emotional distance from one another. In a subsequent interview, Lee revealed that he occasionally only saw Farrah twice a week when she was at the top of her game. Additionally, those times weren't always spent together. They were merely snatches of a once intimate relationship that were squeezed into the calendar between picture sessions and advertising events. No amount of love or patience seemed to be able to stop the distance from increasing. The significance of the celebrity was more painful than the actual recognition. There was more to Farrah's ascent than just popular admiration. It signified a change in connection, values, and priorities. Now, the lady who had depended on him for support was bearing an empire by herself. They also ceased using the same emotional language at some point. Lee has always supported conventional wisdom. He grew up believing that marriage was a holy, lifelong tie. There was no time to slow down, though, since Farrah was redefining her identity in front of the world. She had no intention of harming him. However, there are instances when success has unintended consequences, and their relationship was among the first to suffer. And it was all in front of the world, and just when it looked like they could not be any more stressed, something happened that would shatter whatever was left. It was impossible to overlook the emotional distance between Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett by the late 1970s. Long periods of separation, professional demands, and celebrity had buried the love that had once united them. Although they were still legally married, they were actually leading separate lives as two stars circling different universes. Farrah's schedule was jam-packed with appearances, branding deals, and TV shoots. As his personal life faded away, Lee continued to film The $6 Million Man, bearing the burden of his own career. He allegedly made repeated attempts to save what was left, including contacting others, scheduling time, and even enlisting others to assist them get back in touch. However, Farrah had already started to move on, maybe without realizing it. Another man, and not just any man, delivered the decisive blow. Lee was familiar with Ryan O'Neal. He was a peer, a fellow actor, and once a reliable friend. Their paths had frequently crossed, and they were both well-known figures in the field. Therefore, Lee experienced immediate and intimate grief when he saw tabloid images of Ryan and Farrah together, holding hands, and grinning at events. The affair between Farrah and Ryan was not subtle and garnered media attention. At the time their romance was made public, she and Lee were still legally married. It was all over. Spreads in magazines, late-night TV gags, and unending conjecture. It appeared to be a juicy Hollywood scandal to the outside world. However, it was a whole different matter to Lee, a betrayal that was more profound than anything he had ever encountered. Lee's friends said he was taken by surprise. He didn't receive a call. There was no warning given to him. Through glitzy images and dramatic headlines, he and the rest of America learned. Additionally, he had accepted the man she was with into his life. Perhaps more than anything else, that aspect rendered it inexcusable. Although the exact timing is unknown, some sources have even conjectured that Farrah and Ryan's connection might have started while they were still working to mend their marriage. It's obvious that Lee felt degraded, not just as a spouse, but as a man who had created a life with someone who now appeared to be changing their history with someone else. For her part, Farrah never denied the connection. Before long, she and Ryan were spotted together everywhere. And they were immediately portrayed by the media as the newest Hollywood couple. However, there was always a hint of uneasiness, an implicit knowledge that something holy had been violated. Lee never discussed it in public.
He never gave names. He never struck out.
His quiet, however, was deafening.
He pulled away.
He no longer accompanied her to events.
He ceased discussing personal issues in interviews.
Eventually, he completely stopped discussing Farrah. Though those closest to him knew better, it appeared to the outside world that he had moved on. In addition to losing his wife, he also lost his privacy, his trust, and his faith in the significance of their union. Furthermore, forgiveness was no longer an option because Ryan O'Neal's face was now permanently linked to the dissolution of his marriage.
However, instead of facing the mayhem, Lee Majors took an unexpected action. He vanished entirely from her universe. Lee Majors did something very un-Hollywood once the headlines had subsided and the shock factor had faded. He said nothing. He refused to back down in a place where everyone seemed to finally give their version of events. There were no interviews, confessions from memoirs, or sly press jabs, just stillness. Lee had already emotionally distanced himself by the time the divorce was finalized in 1982, almost 9 years after their wedding. He threw himself into his career, accepting parts in television shows and films that kept him occupied. He was never able to fully rekindle the passion of his $6 million man days. He starred in The Fall Guy, a multi-season program that maintained his reputation. However, friends claimed that he was never really the same behind the scenes. In contrast, Farrah embraced the limelight.
Despite their tumultuous relationship, she and Ryan O'Neal remained together.
The tabloids documented their arguments, their reconciliations, their breakups, and their laughter.
In stark contrast to the man she had left behind, it seemed as though her whole emotional life had become the public domain.
Most strikingly, Lee was completely absent from her story. He was absent at Charlie's Angels reunions.
He was never seen close to her when she was in public.
Avoidance was not motivated by resentment.
It was more akin to a man shielding himself from resentment.
Seldom did interviewers dare mention Farrah's name, but when they did, Lee would typically respond politely and continue. At one point, he casually mentioned that he didn't watch Charlie's Angels when it came out. Why?
He stated it was simply too painful. Knowing how much had been lost and seeing her on film, larger than life, was more than he could take. The fact that Lee never made an effort to correct the record was possibly the most significant indication of all. He never played the victim, criticized Ryan, or placed the blame on Farrah. Rather, he decided to completely vanish from the narrative. He seems to have determined that the only way to maintain control after she left was to disappear from her public life. In private, the wound persisted, according to acquaintances. Yes, he dated, but it didn't seem like anyone could take Farrah's place. He remained single for almost 20 years, concentrating on his career and hiding his private life. He was frequently characterized as pleasant yet being aloof, but with a level of caution that had never been present before. Meanwhile, Farrah remained Farrah, adored, fearless, and frequently in the news, not always for the right reasons. Her relationship with Ryan wasn't smooth, and her career had its ups and downs. However, she continued to be a well-known person who publicly displayed her personal wounds. They stood in sharp contrast to one another. Despite the messiness of her life, she shared it with the world. He tossed the key away and shut the door. Even though it appeared that their experiences would never be told again, years later, something surprising occurred. A quiet, private, and off-the-record opportunity presented itself that had the potential to completely transform their relationship. However, Lee's subsequent actions further supported the long-held suspicions. Certain silences speak louder than words, and certain heartbreaks never completely go away.
Years went by. Both Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett's careers progressed along with the media.
However, something unexpected nearly occurred behind the scenes, a private reunion that might have changed the course of events. In the early 2000s, Farrah had moved into a more sedate stage of her life. She was concentrating more on her art, charitable endeavors, and side acting roles as her relationship with Ryan O'Neal had soured.
Over time, Lee had also softened.
He was now a recognized actor with decades of experience under his belt, rather than the ferocious action hero of the 1970s. At that point, a mutual acquaintance allegedly spoke to them separately about the prospect of getting back in touch. The proposal was straightforward, according to people close to the pair. A private gathering, a chance to communicate, maybe even laugh, and finally put an end to years of silence, not a public show or a reunion for the cameras. Initially, it appeared that both sides were amenable to the concept. It was believed that Farrah had been more receptive to the prospect of seeing Lee once more. Time had softened many of the previous feelings, but she had once loved him very much. Lee, on the other hand, was less certain.
He paid attention. He considered it.
In private, he even acknowledged that he missed the person she had been. Then again, he refused.
He wasn't upset. He didn't harbor resentment.
He simply had no desire to return. There had been too much.
It was too late.
Furthermore, some scars never fully heal, particularly those that are unsaid. His years-long quiet had been motivated by both protection and dignity. He had worked hard to shut a chapter in his life, and seeing her again, even for a few while, meant reopening it.
Farrah received a cancer diagnosis shortly after.
Any chance of a reunion vanished as her condition quickly deteriorated.
Lee didn't come.
He never made contact with anyone in public.
Some
saw it as chile, while others saw it as the most subdued expression of sadness. The type that is always at a loss for words. In actuality, Lee Majors had already bid farewell.
He had released Farrah long before anyone realized she was ill.
In reality, though, that door had never truly shut. And that heartbreak was sealed by what transpired later. Farrah Fawcett was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer in 2006, shocking the globe. She chose to record her experience in a candid, intensely personal video diary that would eventually be aired as a documentary because she tackled her struggle with such bravery.
It was her last public display of vulnerability, unguarded by celebrity and without the glitz. Millions of people watched.
Many people were moved to tears, and even more were impressed by her fortitude in the face of overwhelming difficulties.
However, one person was conspicuously silent the entire time. Majors Lee. Lee remained silent as the media re-examined her legacy and tributes flooded in.
He remained silent.
He didn't show up.
He didn't go to her private fundraisers or public events. It wasn't that he didn't care, quite the contrary. According to many who knew him well, Lee was profoundly impacted by Farrah's situation from the start. He chose to grieve from a distance, according to friends, and discreetly monitored her health updates. Anger was gone, only sadness remained. Even as a consoling gesture, Lee had come to terms with the fact that their chapter had finished a long time ago.
He simply couldn't bring himself to do it.
Nobody knows for sure if it was self-preservation, guilt, or fear.
However, he avoided it.
Following Farrah's death in June 2009, Lee issued a single, well-crafted statement. She battled a horrible illness for a very long time. She was an angel when she was on earth, and she will always be an angel. It was short, courteous, and respectful, but it lacked the affection that had once characterized their romance.
He didn't show up for her funeral. Some claim he was unable to handle it.
Others think that long before she passed away, he had already grieved for her.
Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
The fact that Lee Majors, who previously would have done everything for Farrah, decided to honor her from a distance is evident. His silence, however, spoke loudly even from that distance, and many people think he carried a silent remorse all the way to the end.
Stories are rewritten by time.
Nowadays, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett are frequently viewed through a nostalgic prism, a stunning pair from a bygone period caught in the glare of youth and glory. Their images of them grinning at red carpet events as though nothing ever went wrong are still widely shared online, framed in antique filters. However, those that followed their path are aware that the reality was far more nuanced. After a while, Lee Majors moved on. He remarried in 2002.
This time to an outsider woman in Hollywood.
By all accounts, he found tranquility during this more stable and quiet era. However, despite starting a new life, Farrah's shadow persisted. She had been both his biggest grief and his first true love.
Farrah left a strong legacy as well.
She battled to be recognized as a serious actress despite the turmoil in her personal life, and later in her career, she received praise from critics for her tragic performances. She also became a symbol of bravery in her last years by embracing her sickness with dignity and candor. The story between them, however, was yet unresolved. The two individuals who had previously been everything to one another did not have a final discussion, a public reconciliation, or a peaceful moment. And that enigma remains for fans. Was she ever really forgiven by Lee? Was it ever her desire for him to? The hush that followed her death may hold the solution, as well as the preceding years. She was never publicly attacked by Lee. He never attempted to regain his side of the tale or profit from theirs. Rather, he guarded what remained in secret, out of sight of the camera. Because the woman Lee Majors never stopped loving may have been the one he never forgave.